Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Kathinka Frøystad to you. We were looking forward to welcoming her in person, but for the inevitable visa issues, she couldn't come here in time, and she has kindly agreed to do this online. So thank you very much, Kathinka, for joining us. Kathinka is a scholar of religion from perspective of social anthropology and modern South Asian studies. She focuses primarily on three rubrics: religious change, what makes people alter their religious sensibilities and priorities; two, friction, what forms do religious disputations take, both in the public sphere and in the realm of practice and philosophy; and three, what she calls, interestingly, the cosmopolitan opposite of religious belonging, which is what makes people cross boundaries of religion, and to what extent do such crossings produce what we today understand as cosmopolitan or amicable or civic coexistence. She's been doing field work in many parts of northern India from the 1990s and has also contributed to the ongoing debate about anthropological research methods, both in the traditional field, but also now, as we know, digitally, which is where she comes in as an expert contributor to the project that we are doing here at CSDS on digital religion. Her book, Blended Boundaries, Caste, Class, and Shifting Faces of Hinduness in a North Indian City, came out in 2006. She's also co-edited a wonderful book called Beyond Courtrooms and Street Violence, Rethinking Religious Offense and Its Containment. She's also reflected on how religious experience evolved in context of the coronavirus and has published essays on that in 2021. Another of her very interesting essays, which many of you might be interested in, is called, it came out in 2019, is called Affective Digital Images, Shiva in the Kaaba and the Smartphone Revolution. So Kathinka, we are really excited to have you. And thank you very much once again for making the time. Over to you.
So thank you for your very generous introduction. It's a great honor for me to be invited to give a lecture at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, which is an institute that I've been admiring from afar for many, many years. It's a very important institute for many of us, especially perhaps those of us who live and work in the very periphery of South Asian studies with very little institutional support. And again, I'm very, very sorry that I could not be present to give my talk in Delhi today. But I'm very happy that we now have the possibility of giving this kind of talks also digitally, which of course is part of the new digital realm of communication that I'll be speaking about today, though from an opposite side of the technical possibilities. Anyhow, so I will start by saying that today, as the ChatGPT revolution unfolds all around us, it may perhaps seem obsolete to look back at the smartphone revolution to examine how it may have affected religious change. But then this is how our research works, right? Life can only be understood backwards, as the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard famously said. Besides, the smartphone revolution remains seminal. Not only did it enable more user-generated content than ever before, but the smartphone revolution continues to evolve as long as new apps and functions keep appearing and as ever new groups acquire their first smartphones. So perhaps in a sense, it is only now that we begin to see what impact this technological revolution may be having within the religious domain. So the talk I will present today will make its point of departure in some of the observations that I've had while following a network of low-income people of OBC background ever since they began to acquire their first smartphones in 2013. The people in question all live in the outskirts of Kanpur, and all of them are affiliated to a particular Kali temple, which I've been following for a number of years. And I will try to share my screen here. Can you see the image of the Kali temple here?
We do, yes.
Yes, good. So, due to my acquaintance's association with the temple, my material will not have very much to say about whether OBC Hindus in central UP have become more religious in the past decade or not, no matter how important this question is. And I think it is an important question. But what my material can say something about is how my temple acquaintances and their friends and families began to integrate smartphones into their devotional practices and how they infused their digital communication with devotional content, which in turn raises the question of which devotional practices they used their smartphones to showcase and which they kept away from their smartphones. So the Kali devotees that I came to know best, they hailed from 4 different OBC communities. They were from Mali community, they were Barhais, they were Mallas, or they were from the Maurya communities. All of these communities are classified as OBCs in Uttar Pradesh. Most of those I interacted with had family roots in the surrounding rural areas, and several of them still shuttled back and forth to their natal villages to visit relatives who took care of their modest agricultural fields and ancestral property, as epitomized perhaps by the flower sellers in the region who had their flower fields run by relatives in a village, say 2 hours away, and then they transported them, some of them owned trucks, and they would transport whole truckloads of fresh flowers to the city. They would have the women distributing them in the early wee mornings of the hour, and then they would transport them out to the various shops who would again sell them to the temples, and some of them would be in charge of decorating wedding venues and so on and so forth. So without this constant commute between the rural areas where the fields were and the city where the shops were, this would not be possible. But this is, of course, only one type of interlocutors that I had. Now, working in the city as factory laborers, flower and clothes salesmen, carpenters, electricians, or domestic servants, my designation of these people as working class is perhaps an overly rough approximation. What they all share, however, is an economic position that on the one hand reflects a clear improvement from the impoverished generations before them, but on the other hand, with monthly incomes never exceeding 10 to 15,000 rupees, their economic position was nevertheless precarious, and their economic hopes were constantly jeopardized by unexpected hospital bills or spates of unemployment, just like we currently hear from the workers who now scramble to go to Israel to replace the displaced Palestinian workers there. And of course, in those situations, if they break their smartphones, they can no longer replace it, and they will be without phone for a while. So this is also part of the story. Right. So the argument that I want to make in this talk is that my interlocutors typically use their smartphones to showcase their piety, whether by means of text, memes, or photographs. But not just any piety. The discrepancy between what they shared and what they withheld bears the imprint of a profound public religious normativity, which my acquaintances not only strive to conform to, but also took active part in co-producing. So the political context is of paramount importance here. Only 6 months after my research began, the BJP came to power at the center. And since 2017, the party has held power in UP as well. As many scholars have already remarked, Hindu devotional practices are now virtually omnipresent in the public sphere. One of those who have reflected on this most thoroughly is Anustup Basu in his 2020 book called Hindutva as Political Monotheism, And what Basu does is to analyze this omnipresence as an advertorial mediascape that constantly churns out reminders of what a good Hindu believes, reveres, and does. In Basu's optic, Bollywood films, news media, and digital memes alike continue the normativizing religious reforms initiated in the 19th century by overwriting what he calls voluptuous vernacular traditions, without any need for challenging them explicitly. My interlocutor's smartphone use must be seen in the light of this accelerated normativization. And though it would be tempting to analyze their curated smartphone piety as a new chapter in the long-drawn history of Sanskritization, this analytical framework can easily make us overlook the fact that their normativization was more profound on their smartphones than in their actual devotional practices. Though it is true that their practices show clear sign of following behind, we must take care not to confuse these levels of analysis. So I want to, before fleshing out this argument ethnographically, I want to briefly mention some additional foundational approaches that I rely on. One of them is Irving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life, which is a rather old perspective, but somehow useful, because what it does is to enhance our attentiveness to which kinds of devotional practices people showcase on their smartphones and which devotional practices they'd rather keep to themselves. So though the Goffmanian classic delineation between front stage and backstage activities is dated and rather coarse, it is useful for bringing out the acute awareness my acquaintances have about what kind of digital content that is sufficiently widely acceptable to be shared beyond their immediate community, and what kind of digital content that is not. The flip side of this perspective is a long-standing interest in what people actually do without necessarily being articulate about it. Now, ever since my early days as an anthropologist, I've been inspired by the work of Pierre Bourdieu, whose theory of practice has made me very alert to silent practices and the discrepancy between doing and saying. Again, another binary maybe that needs to be qualified in actual work, but still it's been with me all along, and it's influenced my work in and around this Kali temple much more than actually shows in my writings. Now, to operationalize these perspectives methodologically, when we look into the use of smartphones, it is crucial not to reduce data collection to what many people call data harvesting, even when studying smartphone use. In so doing, I agree with scholars such as Alex Golub and many others that digital practices need to be situated in people's everyday lives rather than studied independently, as certain other scholars argue what one could do. For instance, Tom Bolstov. In my case, this happened rather serendipitously, since my fieldwork had already started by the time my interlocutors obtained their first smartphones. So gradually, my face-to-face communication with them spilled over to the digital realm as soon as the first ones acquired their first smartphones, and those were typically young men. As any anthropologist trained in classic ethnographic fieldwork would do, I thus gradually incorporated smartphone use into my research, and given my prior interest in religious activities, I of course became particularly attentive to the devotional dimensions of their digital lives. So in what follows, I'm going to rely very heavily on research that I've already completed in the shape of book chapters and journal articles. And I will also rely partly on an ethnographic film that two anthropological colleagues who were filmmakers helped me with in 2015 to 2018, when they recorded an educational film for me about the Kali temple that I was working with. And that film is titled A Kali Temple Inside Out, and it is available on various sources which make ethnographic films accessible to a larger public. But in addition to relying on earlier work, I will also take my talk into new directions. So in that sense, what follows will still be work in progress and still be slightly under-theorized. And that also means that I will benefit very strongly from comments and questions after I'm done. So I'm really looking forward to that. Okay, so here it goes. So one of the first things that struck me when I began to accept my acquaintances' friend requests on Facebook and WhatsApp was their extensive use of religious greetings. This is something I describe in my contribution to Outrage, which is a volume that I co-edited in 2019, together with Paul Rollier and Arild Engelsen-Ruud, my colleague here in Oslo. Back then, such greetings far exceeded wishing one another happy Diwali, happy Navaratri, and the like, in connection with the main festivals. Often, entire Facebook threads would consist of religious greetings, such as this. We see here 2 images, one of which is from the inside of the Kali temple. This is taken in connection with a festival. And underneath that particular image, there's a whole stream of comments saying Jai Mata Di, Jai Jai Ma, and so on and so forth. And very little in terms of conversation, though there is some here, but not very much. But those kinds of threads became very, very common at a particular point of time, and we can still see them around. Such threads were typically initiated with when someone posted a religious image or meme, whereupon their contacts would respond with exclamations such as Jai Mata Di, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Jai Ma, etc., depending on the meme posted. Such threads could become remarkably long, as if each of the contacts who spotted the original image or meme felt compelled to respond. Initially, I interpreted these threads as awkward conversations between people who were unsure about what to say to so many strangers at once, but who nevertheless were eager to be liked, noticed, and respected. But on closer thought, I also have come to interpret such religious exclamations as expressions of devotion in their own right, just like many pious Hindus would bow their heads respectfully when driving their cars past an important temple. My acquaintances in the Kali temple would pay a similar form of respect when scrolling past religious images on their smartphone screens. And of course, it is true that digital religious images have a very different ontological status than, for instance, consecrated murtis, but they were nevertheless shown considerable respect. And what I think we need to do as scholars is to try to do more to understand how the proliferation of digital religious images promotes an accelerated devotional attunement. I think this is an important thing that we need to think much more about. And there's a lot of interesting work that is being initiated these days, and I think it's important that we do that. So, religious greetings and exclamations is one thing. Another thing that struck me about my interlocutors' social media use, and which I also remarked in my contribution to the Outrage volume, was their widespread use of religious profile pictures. Now, prior to 2020, as many of you will remember, one could not really lock one's Facebook profile. So before this, many of the young men that I associated with, they used to have several accounts, each for different purposes. Only one would carry their real name and profile photo, and this would normally be the account used for family communication. Their other accounts would have nicknames and generic profile photos of flowers, chubby babies, Hindu deities, or other religious imagery. These accounts were used for eavesdropping, contact expansion, political discussions, and befriending girls, and would sometimes get reported and blocked. As the years went by, and their sisters, wives, and even mothers gained smartphone access, the female presence in social media increased. Yet, many women were more hesitant to claim a digital public presence. Though many wanted to use social media to stay in closer touch with relatives living elsewhere, they were less keen to be seen and judged by strangers. For these women, profile images of Hindu deities, chubby babies, or flowers provided a shield of anonymity, a digital veiling, if you will, that protected them against unwanted remarks at the same time as it underlined their respectability and virtue. Today, young women in this neighborhood either lock their profiles or show their faces, but many women in their mother's generation, mothers will be from, say, 45 and up, they still use religious profile pictures to protect their anonymity while signaling their virtue. The screenshot that I have on the screen here, that is the Facebook connections of one of the female acquaintances in this Kali temple. And as you can see, there are both men and women having religious profile pictures, but the density of these kinds of imageries is quite interesting, I think. Right. So the third feature that characterizes my interlocutors' use of smartphones is the frequency with which they share photos of themselves in the act of doing puja. Now let's see if I can get you one example. Yeah, for instance, like this. Virtually all my interlocutors do puja every day, whether at home or in the temple. These occasions are too ordinary to be photographed, of course. But on festive occasions, when the deity and its temple are beautifully adorned and my acquaintances have dressed up, their smartphones are often pulled out to document the occasion. This is also common if they are traveling and get the opportunity to visit a temple that is new to them. Puja photos like this are highly standardized. The central figures will be the murti, and next to them, the worshipper. And I want you to note the way the worshippers keep their bodies in these photographs. The bodies will be half turned towards the deity to suggest a newly completed act of worship and darshan. But their eyes will be turned towards the photographer and, by extension, to a crowd of imagined viewers that are going to witness this moment at a later time. So in certain ways, the smartphone revolution has given rise to a double darshan, in the sense that it has become as important to be seen in the act of being seen by the god as it is to have this one-to-one meeting with the deity. In major pujas, such photo moments have become an increasingly important constituent of religious practice. It is almost as if no major puja is complete unless it is photographically documented and uploaded to social media. Of course, there is nothing unusual about this. On the contrary, it is quite comparable to the social media sharing we often see on other joyous occasions, such as birthday celebrations, reaching a mountaintop, or meeting a celebrity. Let me nevertheless pause a little to take a closer look at the body posture in these puja photos. Being deeply pious, as my interlocutors are, it is crucial to them that the body is at least partly turned towards the deity. Because in their understanding, gods and goddesses can easily take offense when people turn their backs against them. In the temple, they take great care to face the deity at least halfway at all times. So when they leave the temple after puja, they always walk backwards or sideways down the stairs, never turning their backs towards the deity. And the same principle applies to their puja photographs. And though we've seen, as I'm sure many of you have, though we've seen a lot of full-turn puja photos currently being circulated elsewhere on social media, this is not the kind of photos that my pious acquaintances in Kanpur would endorse. Let me see if I can get an example for you. This one, which shows a woman from another Indian city displaying her own piety in front of a Ganesh Murti, would have, for my acquaintances, her back would be too much turned towards the deity for them to be very happy about it. So in their logic, full-turn puja photos, such as the last one here, would be empty signifiers that turn Hindu devotionality into ostentatious cultural and political identity statements, rather than reflecting a deeply held conviction that gods and goddesses have agency and hold the capacity to interfere in the human world, sometimes with unpredictable outcomes. So these are just like three of the main ways in which I can see that my interlocutors in and around this Kali temple do a lot of religious sharing on their smartphones. And I could easily have gone on to provide additional examples, because indeed there is quite a lot going on, and there are videos and there are this and that. But in the time that remains, I think I'd rather move on to the Goffmanian aspect of their smartphone use and exemplify what kind of religious practices they withheld from digital circulation. So again, for my acquaintances, it needs to be said that the public-private distinction that one finds in Goffman's work is less of a binary than a continuum that spans from their domestic lives to the agoras of public spaces and unrestricted Facebook walls. WhatsApp and messenger communication is, of course, somewhere in between, since this involves communication with predefined contacts and groups, a crucial caveat being that whatever is shared even here can still be forwarded, screenshotted, and spin out of control. And these were the kinds of images that I went on to analyze in the contribution that I made to the outrage volume, which I talked about earlier, right? So this means that people nowadays are very careful about what they share digitally. So that also means that devotional practices that they are less keen on being associated with in the wider public are generally withheld from social media in their entirety, even though they often would use smartphones to memorialize them in the shape of photos and videos. So I'd like to exemplify this with a young man whom I'll simply call Rakesh in this talk, who was a hardworking electrician whom I came to know around 2015 when he still went to school. As far as his education and work permitted, he would visit the temple at least once a day, and he would always be present on special occasions such as kirtans and jagans. Having stayed in regular touch with Rakesh on WhatsApp and Facebook throughout this period, I thought that I had a decent overview of his devotional life, but I was wrong. The first thing he did when I entered his house to meet his family in 2022 was to hand me a photo album. And this was something he did even before he placed me on a chair and got his sister to bring me a glass of water, which of course is the normal structure of visitor hospitality in this region. Before I could even sit down, I had the photo album in my hands. And he stood beaming next to me and awaited my reactions. And in this album, I could see photo after photo of Rakesh with a long, thick spear through his cheek. This is Rakesh and a friend in that particular act. Now, the photos showed him being penetrated with a spear, walking in procession with a spear, lining up alongside other young male devotees with spears, posing next to his mother with a spear, and so on and so forth. And there was a whole album full of these photographs. These photos were all from the previous temple festival, the Kali Mela, which is held every year in April. The Kali Mela in 2022 had been the first after a long period of pandemic restrictions. And for this special occasion, Rakesh had decided to confirm his dedication to the goddess in this painful way. Now, spear sacrifice is only conducted once a year in this temple, and until recently, mostly by young unmarried men. Several of my other male acquaintances had been through this on earlier occasions, the documentation of which was fondly kept in similar photo albums and showed to trusted visitors. Though what we see on this particular photograph is clearly a selfie, most of these photos are actually taken by professional photographers who are hired for the occasion, and this still happens. These photographers are still around, but of course now their work has serious competition from smartphone users who'd rather take their own photographs. And Rakesh, who happened to have a smartphone camera, which was much better than my own, turned out to have a lot of pictures of this event on his smartphone as well. But interestingly, he had not even shared a single one on social media, not even in private communication on WhatsApp. When I expressed surprise at this, Rakesh simply shrugged his shoulders and said Log samajh nahi karenge. People will not understand. What did he mean by that? Well, Rakesh, as it turned out, he had actually shared similar photos on social media on earlier occasions. He had done so in 2019 and 2020, but very much had evidently changed between 2020 and 2022. Not only had the normative pressure of the advertorial mediascape continued, Rakesh had also come of age and was about to land a job as an electrician in a government hospital, which meant that his network was under expansion and he had become more concerned than before about his public reputation, which is why in 2022, he did not share these images. Rakesh is but one of many examples of this reluctance to share. And I find it interesting that since 2022, the only people whom I've seen sharing photos of spear sacrifice during the annual temple festival were actually the local ABVP leaders, the local leaders of the Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, who turned up to patronize the event on behalf of the ruling party. And that is something we can discuss later on. Okay, so let me now move on to provide some additional examples of what my interlocutors do not share. Because spear sacrifice was not the only religious practice that was withheld from digital circulation. The same was the case with possession and animal sacrifice, both of which used to occur on a weekly basis in this temple when I began to hang out there in 2013. Almost every Monday and occasionally on Saturdays, Kali medium would lend his body to the goddess so that she could talk directly to her devotees. This is one example of that. This is a still photo from the film that we recorded. The medium you can see with his tongue half out, and he's hugging some devotees in the blessing here. Now, to be blessed and advised by the goddess in person was a formidable boon for Kali devotees. And when the goddess appeared and made herself known by the medium's protruding tongue and feminized body language, devotees would throng into the sanctum sanctorum of the temple in order to come close to her. These scenes were never shared on social media. They were not even photographed. In part, this was, of course, because these situations were so intense, chaotic, and short-lived. But it was also due to an acute awareness that possession was a contested religious practice. Even those who jostled for personal attention from the goddess would have heard people say that possession was mere play acting. Nartak or notanki would be the expressions used, or that it was superstition. Consequently, all those who attended such events, or even those few who aspired to become mediums themselves, found it best to be very discreet. And as a result, possessions were neither photographed nor much talked about, and far less, of course, shared on social media. And the story continues actually because in 2019, the temple committee declared that possession should no longer take place here. And as far as I know, the medium on this photo has terminated his work rather than looked for new venues for his services. So in this way, it looks as if the reluctance to share things on social media and the contestation that motivated that actually prefigured what became an actual religious change, at least here. A similar dynamics played itself out in the case of animal sacrifice. When I started to study this Kali temple in 2013, goats were still sacrificed here once a week or so, and also, of course, in the annual temple festival in April. It is true that I never saw any of my interlocutors sacrifice animals, but many of my friends and acquaintances did seva in the temple, and so many of them would actually assist families who turned up with a sacrificial goat, showing them where to kill it, where to place its head afterwards, and how to sacrifice it properly to the goddess. Despite their propensity for sharing images of major temple events, they never shared images of animal sacrifice. Just like in the case of possession, One reason was their acute awareness of how contested animal sacrifice had become throughout the country. And indeed, the temple committee ended up prohibiting animal sacrifice too in this temple in 2018 or 2019. I haven't been able to find out exactly when this happened. But that awareness of the contested nature of goat sacrifice was not the only reason for this reluctance, I think. There was another element to this as well, which was my interlocutors' awareness of the kind of situations that drove Hindus to sacrifice goats in this area. Because here, goats were no longer sacrificed as a token of devotion, but rather in deep desperation. For many, a goat sacrifice was a final resort, and my temple acquaintances would find it rude to ask what kind of problem that had motivated anyone to bring a goat to the temple, and even ruder to photograph such an event. So there was always, these events were always surrounded by a kind of secrecy, or sometimes the family who came with the goat and hired drummer, they would be pitied a little bit because they evidently had been in a difficult situation that necessitated this kind of large sacrifice or bali. Right. So now to the fourth thing that is never shared on social media by people such as my interlocutors, and that is their rare but still occurring dargah attendance. When my temple acquaintances themselves were in trouble, they sometimes sought divine intervention from beyond their own temple. Depending on the problem at hand, this would occasionally drive them to visit Sufi Muslim dargahs, such as in this case, the man we see on the picture here was he's a Maurya Hindu who did seva in the temple for the longest of time by polishing the brass lion that guards the sanctum sanctorum. His wife had a problem with physical and mental health, and he ran from pillar to post in order to get help for her. And when nothing helped, he ended up in this dargah in his hometown of Banerjee. I have a number of such cases as well. Now, such visits, which were typically prompted by sustained infertility, irresolvable family disputes, or suspected spirit possession, which was the case with the suspicions that arose in this case with the wife and husband. They were done with utmost discretion and never publicized in social media. I have described such instances in earlier writings, and I do not have time to go into detail here. But the point I want to make for this presentation is very simply that the more a devotional practice is rooted in necessity and misfortune, the less it will be photographed and shared on social media. So where does this leave us? Well, my provisional conclusion is as follows. What is shared is the selfless devotion, the festive devotion, and the devotional practices that reflect normative models of what a good Hindu, and increasingly today a good Indian citizen, believes, reveres, and does. What is not shared are devotional practices that are contested or done in desperation. Now, the extent to which smartphone devotion prefigures and amplifies religious change, which in this case would be in a Sanskritized and exclusivist direction, is of course very difficult to say from the kind of singular case study that I have conducted here. But it would be very interesting to find out, I think. And in order to do that, we need more studies that relate people's smartphone use to their everyday lives, then isolating it and studying it from afar. And we also need more sociologists and anthropologists integrating smartphone use in broader social studies in what they do. So I think I'll end there so that we'll rather have more time for questions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathinka. That was really fascinating and quite eye-opening, actually. we can see a number of questions on the screen, but I just want to start off the discussion with two thoughts. One is to deeply appreciate the caution that you express when you say that do not necessarily go by what is on the screen. And do not read historical change in terms of simply what is on the screen. Think also of what is not. And that, I think, is a very important, both methodological and philosophical point to think with. And I don't think it's commonly thought of with such clarity in work on the digital medium today, because it's pretty evident that the digital media is seen itself as an archive. And, so the maximum that we have is debates on misinformation and disinformation, but we do not raise questions of the archival claims of the digital. So 20 years down the line, if we look at digital images, from your account, we will understand only half the picture. And it has to be tied to ethnographic or other archival studies from everyday life. And that, I think, is a very important point that you have made for us to think with. The second thought that struck me, and I really would want you to speak a little more on that, is the fact that you mentioned that you started your fieldwork in this area on religion prior to the coming of smartphones. And you saw smartphones coming in first to young men, then to the women of the household, and so on and so forth. If you could say a little more on the diachrony of this story. I mean, apart from the fact that what gets registered on the digital from one's everyday life, has everyday life changed in a way? I mean, I'm asking the reverse question. Because you have worked for that length of time, when it was pre-digital and when it was post-digital, what would you say in terms of the very idea of religiosity having changed? Which is a separate question from the pressure of normativity and overall politics and so on. So does the digital change our experience of religiosity per se, and not merely the representation of it? So that's the other thought that I thought is very, very interesting too. You are the person that can think it through because of the length of your fieldwork. So thank you very much. So if you want to take a few minutes to respond, and then we'll take more questions.
I'll try. And thank you so much for these comments and questions. Yeah, I think it is important to say that people such as my interlocutors, even though they are marginalized in many ways, we read about them every now and then, but otherwise they do not have a very large public presence until now. Of course, they do have in the smartphone age, but who reads that, right? They are nowhere in the newspapers and anything. Yeah, how has everyday life changed? They are not passive recipients of any production of normativity, right? I think that's a very important point. They are co-producing it, and they're doing it every day by publishing all sorts of things, by engaging in activities online, which they do, by interacting with people, whether or not they use religious imagery in their interaction, but they do that quite a lot. And so I think it's important not to think that this is something that happens, from top and down. Yes, that happens too, but it's not only that. We really have to see the co-production of it, and also most of the people that I know are, yeah, they are pragmatic, but they're also deeply devotional, right? So it comes from within as well, and if it does anything, it's maybe changing the ways in which they are devotional more than it's actually. Well, I said my material didn't speak very well about it, but I can't really see that it's making them more religious. it's making them more aware about how to be religious, and when it is appropriate to use religious imagery and when it is not. But yeah, being part of that, and this very participatory dimension of the big change that is going on in India now, I think it's important to see that it comes from very many different directions, and from sometimes unexpected directions as well. So yeah, that is one change that I can see. Of course, smartphones have changed their lives in many other ways as well that are not necessarily religious. I mean, for instance, this is something that many scholars have already remarked upon, right? The ability to have close contact with family, relatives, friends who live elsewhere. I mean, this is very important for a number of people to have this dense, extended family network that you are very close to, even though you have, you may be like a third generation migrant, right, from village to village, or you have married here or there, or you have taken up work elsewhere, and a lot of people live like that. And the ability to feel connected and to be connected is emotionally good for many people. It provides them with an enhanced safety net and so on and so forth. And well, so when there's nothing to talk about, you can say Jai Shri Ram, and it's been a lot of analysis about that expression lately. And it is true that in some cases it has been used almost as a war cry. But in 95% of the cases, it is not, right? And I think we need to acknowledge that as well. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take other questions now. Let me first have a look at the screen if there are questions that. Oh, can you read the questions, Kathinka?
Let me see. Oh, there's one question of ChatGPT. Have you seen any effect of ChatGPT in Kanpur, for example? Ask me again in 5 years. That's the best answer I can give to that. I haven't seen it yet. But I'm sure it must be happening, and I'm sure there's a lot of things going on right now that I am not aware of yet, simply for the fact that I cannot be there the whole time. I have work, I have teaching, I have, old parents and all that, which ties me to the freezing cold country of Norway most of the time. And so it's only once a year or so that I do have the opportunity to go and visit India. But this is actually one of the questions that I really want to follow up. I saw on digital media that there was a lot of production of AI imagery of Hindu deities. There was a lot of experimentation with that initially, and a lot of people treated that like photographs, because the good thing about photographs, even if they are digitally created and based on artificial intelligence, is that they make it seem as if it brings out the reality in the way that reality itself cannot. And so to follow that development and to see how artificial intelligence imagery, I'm particularly interested in photographs here, become a part of these memes that are circulated and that generate this wow effect and that have this strong emotional appeal to us is one thing that I will try to follow in the coming years, but it's a bit too early to say right now. But thank you for that question. Yeah.
The other question is by our colleague Ravi Sundaram, who himself is a media scholar. So if you could read the question and.
Yes, let me take 1 minute. The question is ethics ethics of sharing, and how it's also about the successive technological revolutions in India, where things began with cassettes and VHS tapes, and
You
DVDs.
also asking about the aesthetics of the of the whole thing, and the erotics. In fact, both the aesthetics and the erotics of a certain kind of technologization, as opposed to, let us say, the video culture of the 1980s and 90s, which was, I mean, even in your area, Kanpur and around, that moment of, video cassettes and its mobilization for religious purposes was hardly written about. And then from the 90s to today, when we are talking about digital, smartphones and digital media, and how the logics of congregation or assembly or bodily comportment, he has an interesting point here where he says that there is a certain way in which people share erotic and intimate content, which is also highly managed and carefully done. And there is a similar way to share religious content too. So is there something overlapping there which is intrinsic to the medium rather than intrinsic to either religion or erotica?
I think there is. I don't know if I want to go too far down the eroticism line, whether you mention it metaphorically or no. But I'd say, yeah, there is something in the medium. This is, of course, a perspective that I've used earlier, that the medium creates new practices, creates new desires, creates new wants. Now, I do think at least everybody that I've worked with in Kanpur, not just since 2013, but since I first started working there in 1992, in a different part of the city anyhow, but they have always been very visually attentive. So TV, films were much more interesting for most people than books. It's always been a very strong visual culture, right? And I think that it continues into the smartphone age. For instance, an entire communication can be with photographs rather than with words, showing photographs of themselves in different situations, demanding, especially when I communicate with my interlocutors from afar, demanding similar kinds of photos with me. What are you doing? Show me what you're doing. And I can stand there, and I have a very bad hair day and I stand in front of something in the kitchen and they demand, show me what you're doing, right? And this is how it goes. I must also say that I didn't even know what WhatsApp was before this fieldwork started. It was my interlocutors who demanded that I should, download this app and communicate with them on that as well. And now, of course, I've become a WhatsApp user like anybody else. But, they were like always 2 steps before me. And so it's they who have taught me everything. And I think, there was also a question there about the acute awareness about the technological mediation and how the eyes are always turned towards the camera. That was actually a point I was trying to make. Maybe it didn't come out clearly enough. That was what I meant by saying that it's as if a double darshan is under development, right? Because you don't only have darshan, you and the deity, but there's also the other darshan there. There's the people who should see you having the darshan. And so your eyes will be there and your body will be there, and you have to be attentive to both at the same time, even while they are at the opposite end of your own body. So it's always this pose, which I find very interesting. So there's an acute awareness about technological mediation. And of course, from another scholarly perspective, you would say that this is becoming so much a part of the everyday life that there's no point in drawing these boundaries anymore. And I think that is a valid point. But it will only take you so far, because that is not the kind of perspective that will help you to understand what kind of digital practices that are not shared. So, it's as if smartphones are integrated into our everyday behavior on the one hand. At the other hand, there's also a residual that is not there. And so we need to have these thoughts in our heads at the same time. And it's hard. It's hard, right? I'm just in the beginning. I mean, I've followed this since 2013 in a way. And at the same time, I really feel shaky when I start talking about it, because I know it can be looked upon in so many different ways.
Mm. And then there is Radhika Chopra's interesting question. How is the book of images kept, preserved, cared for? The question about the cloth, is it covered in cloth? This is a tradition that is followed by people who worship the Quran, right? They keep the Quran wrapped in a cloth, and they kiss it. And there is something holy about the book itself. Is the book of images, which cannot be put on social media, acquire a different kind of sanctity, and does it connect with the care of the self? That's the question that Radhika is asking.
Thank you for this question, Radhika, and thank you for turning up. This is a wonderful question. To be totally honest, this happened so fast that I didn't really have time to see it. But from what I could see, Rakesh took this album from one of the shelves that was like the same kind of in the same niche that his home temple was. I don't know, it wasn't a part of the temple, but it was lying there on the same shelf. I didn't see a cloth. I did not see a cloth, nor have I seen a cloth around the similar photo albums that I've seen in other houses. But they've been carefully kept close to the temple because, yeah, it is what it is. But they're not, as far as I know, treated as a sacred object in themselves. But it would be interesting to look further into that, right? It's not a what kind of status those things actually have? It would be a question that I think is comparable to the mode of thinking that we need to do about digital religious images. What kind of status do they have when, at the one hand, they are not consecrated, but on the other hand, they are not mere representations that are dead? There is some kind of effect in them. But how do we talk about that, right? And I'm not really sure of what to say, except for the fact that we have to be attentive to what people do with them and how people respond to them. And it's only through that, I think, that we can find out what they mean to people.
So, Ayodhya, if you let Sumbul in, she's just raised her hand. She's on the screen somewhere, so she could ask a question herself.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can see you though.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Frøystad. This was very wonderful. I have just two questions. I'll just start with the first one, which I think Dr. Sundaram had also mentioned. And I think this idea of the double darshan that you talk about, I actually thought it was a different kind of darshan that you're mentioning. So I thought when you're talking about double darshan, because darshan, as Ek would say, it's double already. I mean, it's not just the devotee seeing the deity, but also the deity seeing the devotee. So it's double to begin with. I thought here, when the audience is also involved, because you are opening up that space. So what's also happening is, I thought the double darshan meant the darshan for the audience. The audience seeing this deity, apart from, of course, the people who are physically present. And I think more than the sense of
Sumbul, you're breaking up. Say that again. Last sentence.
turning. Problem, I'll disconnect. I'll try to write my question if it's too spotty.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I'll just complete the second part, which I think is really the crux of your work, the non-normative aspect of images which are not shared. And I think it really, Dr. Banerjee pointed out, this what is not shared and the non-normativity of what's shared is very interesting, because the non-normativity pans two different ends almost, so there's one end of one's own tradition and aspects of it which are seen as problematic, contentious, or not easily understood, as well as other traditions. So visiting, let's say, a Muslim dargah, which might not be understood equally. But then when this person, Rakesh, is not sharing his speared photograph after getting a government job, I think there's also this understanding of an acceptable believer or an acceptable form of belief. So he can be a believer, but there's a certain kind of acceptability even within that realm of belief. So there is a construction of a certain image which it is related to a certain kind of religiosity, which is, I don't know if we could call it non-radical, if we could call it modern, but a certain kind of religiosity which is being showcased through what is not shared. And this, I think, relates to these movements within religion towards modernity, if we could just sort of or certain non-traditional format, which is more acceptable in, let's say, a bureaucratic space like a Sarkari hospital. I think this is something which can really be taken forward in your work. And I think it's very, very interesting because what we don't see and why we don't see it actually tell us more about, how these images are being constructed. So that's all. Thank you so much for wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I respond to that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. I would just like to thank you for those comments. I so agree with you on the second point, and actually on the first point when you say that what is double darshan is already double darshan. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. There is the devotee seeing the god seeing the devotee, and then comes in the photographer and those who will later see it. Maybe one should use a different expression on that. I'll think about that, but absolutely you're right. Yes. So and I think, but I do think that this thing about normativity and the awareness about what is acceptable in a wider society or not is growing, and there's also a lot of pragmatism associated with that. I think that we need to take into account. There is perhaps also on the part of the temple committee who prohibited two of the sort of vernacular devotional practices, namely possession and goat sacrifice in that temple in 2018 or 19. Their pragmatics and why they did it is also an interesting question here, because this is part of the picture. There's also something about they have to manage things in a situation which is becoming increasingly normative on all sorts of fronts, but they also have to manage temple events, and they have to negotiate with the local government and so on and so forth. And so to show off a more sort of acceptable and more sanitized temple is probably a smart thing to do in many ways, right? So there's that. But there's also something that possibly is a double movement, and I'm not really sure if it is, and I'm not really sure how it should be analyzed, but I find it very interesting that those who actually do nowadays share images of the spare penetration that goes on in the annual festival on social media, they were the ABVP workers. And so that signals to me some kind of political support at the same time as the main party itself stays away, but they sort of send their small brother there. The small brother does that work for them. And so they are somehow taken into an acceptance of what it actually can mean to be a Hindu if the Hindu identity is to be expanded at the lower rungs, which of course has been going on for some time. So the question then is whether at the same time as there is a strong normativization going on, then is there also an expansion going on at the other end, right? I'm not sure if it is, but I think this is a very interesting question to explore. And I don't know if I will be able to find out what goes on in my area because, you know, I'm a foreign scholar, and sometimes when I come, people who represent the temple committee or the government can be a little tight-lipped. And so I'm probably the not right person to go into these questions, but I think those of you who have better access to those kinds of areas, it would be interesting to look at that.
So just on that point, there are another question here, but before I, you know, this body piercing your tongue, your cheeks, etc., has had a long tradition. And not only around Kali worship, but also very much around Shiva worship, as you know. There is some interesting work on what is called Gajan festival in Eastern India, in which this kind of activities, including walking on live coals, and there is a story of caste there. And since you've worked with caste for a while, and your interlocutors also identify as OBC, there might be something there to further investigate, you know, certain quote unquote lower caste practices, which are non-Sanskritic and have a different bodily politics to it than the upper caste idea of the, you know, the clean and pure puja and or darshan. Maybe there is something about caste that we can, and a secret story of caste which is available via the division in what can go on social media and what can't. I don't know. I'm just guessing from another context. So just a thought. So there's another question out here in the room. So give us just a moment.
Thanks a lot for this presentation. While I was listening to the presentation, I was trying to think if there is a central component in conceptualizing or making sense of piety in the realm of the digital. I was thinking that if there's a condition of possibility that makes showcasing and concealment possible in this particular case. Now, as I was thinking about this, I felt, or it occurred to me that skill happens to be, or rather appears to be central, so central that I'm thinking that will it at all be possible for a practitioner to perform the act of showcasing or concealing without having access to a particular skill? Or now I'm trying to historically situate it that are we to think of religion in the digital realm as such, where among many other components like devotion, piety, has skill become more important or a central ingredient in animating this entire world or universe of religious practices in the digital realm? Like, so I'm just thinking about skill.
Can you just tell me what you mean by skill in this context?
The ability, the knowledge, and the ability to operate or make use of the digital technologies, like access to digital technologies, for that matter, the knowledge to operate the smartphone or every other device associated to this practice, like the knowledge and the skill. I'm putting it as skill, probably my ideas are half baked at this moment. I do not have a clear idea about it, but I'm just thinking that for a person to be able to do this, they must have a skill to even operate that device. Can a person who doesn't know how to operate a device, for them, these distinctions, like what to showcase and what to conceal, which things to be dissected, which things to be kept, which things to be showed, like these distinctions. Editing, editing is a part of it. Definitely, editing is a part of it. Yeah, so I'm just thinking that if these.
Thank you.
Hang on, there's another question which wants to join in with this question about skills.
Okay.
Hold on for a moment. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This was super interesting. I'm by no means a sociologist or an anthropologist, so forgive my ignorance if there's any, but I just wanted to say, I mean, I've noticed some ways in which skill, what you refer to as skill here, like the sophistication of how you use your digital media, right? How that sort of plays into, like, I've thought about this for a while. I just wanted to give you a small anecdote. So I'm wondering how, while it's an archive, not all the archive is fully public, right? I mean, there is an in-between, like you have Facebook groups, which are public to some folks, and then there are WhatsApp groups, which are open to people of some communities and so on and so forth. So I have noticed that, like where I come from, which is in Kerala, I come from a family of practicing Hindus, and with the advent of the smartphone, I've seen that a lot of the, especially the Sanskritized, shlok, like reciting shlokas, or like participating in, there's this thing called Ramayanam narration that happens during the period of 1 month in Kerala. And nowadays there's this tendency to use WhatsApp voice message. So, there's a WhatsApp admin, and then they sort of, assign different parts of the shlokas to different people, and they voice note it and send it on the group. And then there's this one, the admin person again sort of collates all of the voice notes and puts them in one recording and then sends it back. So this kind of, so just wondering how, so my question essentially was related to that, but also to bring in the point of how a skill and sophistication of how you deal with what is public, private, and how you sort of mediate those boundaries. And also how I've also noticed that a lot of people who do join these online sort of are people who sometimes can't go to the, temple or so on and so forth. So, and they have extenuating circumstances which force them to sort of, take this path. So just wondering what this semi-private public, how that plays into it, and also whether things that are concealed, like your own problems, sort of push you to demonstrate more religiosity in your digital practices in order to, like, just wondering if there's a connection there. I'm not sure if I'm clear. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Kathinka.
Thank you. Those are interesting questions. I have not really thought about skill in that way, but it is important. Though I think I can say quite safely now that after 10 years of smartphone use in this region, people have acquired the skill now to at least share and comment, with the exception from those few, fortunately, who are not very good at reading or writing, but even those can still operate smartphones and share images normally. So that is being done. As far as I know, WhatsApp groups for sharing and putting together recording or something, that's not done very much in the area that I work. What they do, though, some of them, is to edit images where they can take the face of someone and they can, you know, edit the background, and they put a mountain here and a river there, and suddenly it looks like a religious digital image out of an ordinary face portrait, for instance. And so they're playing around with that, and they learn new stuff, and playing and learning, I think, is important in this connection. But I do not think that the maintaining the boundary between what is showcased and what is concealed relies on any form of digital skills, because that boundary is already there. It is there in what you talk freely about and what you do not talk freely about. It's there in, for instance, if something troubles you, you don't approach your home temple, but you go to a temple in the next town where nobody can recognize you, right? Or you go across your own religious tradition sometimes. So the concealment has a larger, or has much deeper roots than that. What we do see now, though, is that probably things that could be done openly previously are now being concealed, right? Previously, people would go more easily to the Dargah for a simple blessing. That, I think, is less common now than what it used to be. You'd seek it up if you have to, right? That is at least the development that I can see in central UP. So things are changing. Things are changing, but are they changing because of the development of the digital? There are many reasons, but I do think I stand firm by my very strong conviction that the smartphone use and the entire digital realm is a sort of part of this whole transformation that we are witnessing now, very much so, and that it happens by a lot of variously positioned actors all across the board. And to understand how the participatory aspect of it is important. And of course, one aspect of this participation is to learn to move, to learn the skills it takes to move the boundary between concealment and showcasing also into the digital realm, right? I think to maintain discretion where required, to know where certain things can be shared but not others, to know where you can post what, right? And that skill is something that a lot of people really have now, which they didn't that much 8 or 10 years back. So that is changing as well. Yes.
So is there anything else on the screen? And we have another question in the room, Kathinka. Let's just check the screen one quickly. Okay. I think, Kathinka, you have more or less talked of this.
There is one question here from Satya.
Right.
Has there been any observed increase or decrease in Facebook use for personal religious expressions in recent years, like after the pandemic or in anticipation of the election this year? The elections are still a few months away. I think it's a little too early to say. What one saw was, of course, a huge participation in connection with the Pran Pratishtha in Ayodhya. A lot of people that I saw who really looked forward to the event and who followed the event and who used Facebook to express their joy and to congratulate their fellow Hindus on this wonderful occasion, the opening of the new temple of Ramlala in Ayodhya. So that was a big event that saw a huge spurt in Facebook use, I think, among a lot of people, but also including my interlocutors. Apart from that, did Facebook have a particular role during the pandemic? Not so much in connection with this temple, I think. This temple was closed, not much was shared from this temple, in contrast to some of the bigger temples where people or the temple committee put up a public darshan, which of course required a lot of know-how and electronic equipment and all that. That did not happen in this temple. So I think roughly the question is not so much. It's around special events that it happens. That's when you see the big turnout. Mm.
I have one last question from the room, Kathinka.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I really found the distinction between normative devotion and non-normative devotion that is not shared on the screen very interesting. I was thinking through the concept of double darshan, and I was just thinking about the performativity of how in like a normal darshan without the mediation of technology itself, there is this aspect of the deity sort of giving itself to be seen by the to the devotee, right? So in a way, like the deity exalted sort of performance is happening in that darshan, in that meeting with the god. Now when we look at those pictures in which the devotees is getting clicked while worshipping the deity, we see a reversal of this relation in some manner, in the sense that the devotee himself is giving himself to be seen to the camera while worshipping the deity. So the exalted sort of status of the god, the aura of the deity that is there in that in that meeting, that relationship between the deity and the devotee gets mediated, I think, in some manner. And I'm just wondering, like, what that new relationship now becomes when the digital sort of sharing of this darshan happens. And yeah, in that sense, then I think to call like normative devotion becomes also kind of tricky, because by the presence of digital itself, the normativity of like how normally the devotion used to take place, the darshan used to take place, has already changed. The relationship dynamic has already changed. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
I'm not really sure if this is a fascinating question. And there is clearly something that is happening to the primary darshan when the awareness of the smartphone is there. But we should also keep in mind that the darshan still happens one-to-one, after which one turns one's head, right? And so it doesn't come in the moment itself, but it comes immediately afterwards, after the main moment. And so the extent to which it changes the main darshan, I don't think it does. I don't think it does. I think that is intact, but there is something happening in the immediately afterwards, which comes in this desire to share this pious, joyous, deeply devotional moment with a larger public. Those kinds of darshan images are normally not the ones that elicit comments such as Jai Mata Di or Jai Jai Ma or these kinds of things. So they are somehow strangely not as effective as an image of only the deity. And what this means, I am not so sure, but I think we need to think deeply about, and I don't have the answer yet, and that's why it's very important to have all your comments, and that this is a sort of collective endeavor, that we think deeply about what that new performativity does, why people find it important to do it, and what it does to those who photograph, those who want to be photographed, and to those who see it afterwards. And so I think we need more studies of that. But it's quite clear that we've come very far from the situation we were maybe 20 years ago or so, where the very act of bringing a camera into a sanctum sanctorum to photograph the murti was not considered a good thing to do, you know? And it's not very long ago, but here we are. People do it all the time. And there are very few murtis that are not being photographed in this way. Does it also happen to murtis that, you know, could it happen to the Sabrimala, for instance? Does it happen there? Does it happen to murtis that are under some kind of restrictions? You know, we need to open up those situations for scrutiny. I don't have the answer now, but I think this is it. There's an whole new field of scholarship that really needs to be opened up more, I think. So thank you for that question.
That's been a really nice discussion, Kathinka. And interestingly, you know, there's something to be thought, and apropos the last question, something to be thought about the fact of how we are re-experiencing the thing we call memory or memorialization, which requires a completely different regime of creating records. Right. So including, I mean, this is not specific to religiosity, though specific to the question of religion is the question of inwardness of the religious experience and being with the self and being with the deity privately, as opposed to being in camera or within a frame, or even when the camera is absent, imagining yourself being as if being within the frame. So that is a specific religious question, but more generically, the question of why and when things need to be constantly recorded and memorialized. So you go to the mountain and see a grizzly bear and you click it before you see it, right? So
before it gets eaten.
Yeah, before you get eaten. So yeah, so what is the compulsion of memorializing the moment? That's very much come with the digital camera, the phone camera. And that was not the case with camera of the earlier kind, which had a much restricted mobility and so on. So I think there's something to be thought there overall. But this is just to say that so many thoughts have kind of come up in this conversation. And, this was superly enjoyable. And I wish you were here so we could carry this over to the evening. But thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, this was really nice. And hopefully, inshallah, we'll be meeting you soon when you come to India. Okay.
Hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye and take care. Bye.